Hey all, welcome to the Institute and this week's top 10. Now it's December, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be doing holiday themed top 10s and favorite collections for the month of December. So today I'm starting with my top 10 favorite Claus action figures. Now, I didn't say Santa Claus, I know it said that in the title, but when I realized I was going to do true Santa Claus, these aren't Santa Claus figures where somebody's dressed up like Santa Claus. God knows I've got about 30 or so of those. No, not like this guy. That's just somebody dressed up like Santa Claus. No, we're going to do actual Santa Claus figures. Well, that's a little more difficult. And I realized, you know what? Mrs. Claus does actually all the work. Santa gets all the credit. And so we have to add some Mrs. Claus figures in there too. So these are going to be either Mrs. Claus or Santa Claus, actual Claus figures. And we're going to start out with a Mrs. Claus. McFarlane did their version of Mrs. Claus. And you can probably guess that this candy cane pole dancing Mrs. Claus drew quite a bit of attention when it was released. And she gets my number 10 spot, if for no other reason, the sheer shock value that she provides. Now, a little more standard version of Mrs. Claus is the one that came with the Rudolph television show. Here we have the Rankin Bass Rudolph version. She was a whole lot nicer than Santa Claus was in that cartoon, and she's getting my number 9 spot. One that will not be in any of the 10 is this Mrs. Claus back here. This is Mrs. Claus from The Year Without Santa Claus, done by Palisades. They did a terrific job. But this is just a creepy figure. You thought that McFarlane version was creepy? No. This one looks to me like she has all the sinning teenagers, and she's turned them into holiday cookies. So let's talk about number 8. Number 8 is going to also be from McFarlane. They did their version of Santa Claus to go with that Mrs. Claus. And yeah, he's as creepy as you expect him to be, including his Freddy Krueger hands. You knew that McFarlane was going to do something weird when they did their Santa Claus line, their Christmas line, and they certainly did. But he is a terrific sculpt. He's a great looking figure. Underneath that mask, there's actually a really creepy face. So yeah, he gets the number 8 spot. I said I did not like the Mrs. Claus from The Year Without Santa Claus. I do like Santa, though. He is that rotund, fun Santa Claus. He has a real metal chain there for his watch. That, like I said, these are done by Palisades. They did this whole line of Year Without Santa Claus. They did a marvelous job with him, like they did with everything they worked on. And you can actually see they did a couple box sets as well that were exclusives. Number 6 is Santa Claus from Rudolph. He's right here next to Mrs. Claus. He's the fat, jolly Santa that we all know. I think it's the facial hair that wins me over on this particular version of Santa. Because not only did he get the number 6 spot, he also gets the number 5 spot in the skinny version. This is before when Mrs. Claus, he loses all that weight every year. Mrs. Claus has to fatten him up. Now, mind you, this version of Santa Claus is one of the worst people. Just an awful human being. He treats Rudolph so bad. But he was the evil villain in that cartoon, which is kind of the point. Now, I did not get a Nightmare Before Christmas Claus. He would be on this list if I did, but I do have their Mrs. Claus, and she's getting number 4. All of the designs, the character designs for the Nightmare Before Christmas were great. And of course, this Mrs. Claus is right up there with him. So she's getting the number 4 spot. Number 3, we're actually going to have to take a bit of a walk. Because this Santa Claus is not with all the others. Like the McFarlane Claus, this is an evil Santa Claus. You thought there weren't a lot of evil Santa Clauses? Well, there is one here in the Futurama line, Robot Santa. He comes in 2 versions, actually. They did him as a Build-A-Figure, and you got a machine gun with that one. They also did the one that came with the Santa version of Bender. don't worry, you'll see that Santa bender on my list when we get to the characters dressed up as Santa Claus. That was the Toynami line. They did such a fantastic job. Now we're going to come back down around here and talk about the Four Horsemen. Every year they do a figure obscura character. This year it's Jacob Marley, if you haven't seen it yet. But last year they did this excellent Father Christmas. This is Santa Claus from before we got a hold of him. This is pre-19th century European version of what Santa Claus looked like, Father Christmas. And he did a fantastic job with this figure, getting the cloth goods right. They had a ton of accessories. Excellent figure. But the number one Claus is right next to him over here. Fresh Monkey Fiction Santa Claus. They did a whole line of these. They put him in all kinds of outfits, camo, and all kinds of interesting costume paint jobs. But this is the basic Thomas Nast modern Santa Claus. And they did an excellent job with him. They're also doing some more. They've got elves and other characters that they're doing. They've got a bunch out there for this year. If you like this character, go check that out. Fresh Monkey Fiction. So that's my top 10 actual Santa Claus figures. Now, there are other characters dressed as Santa. We're going to see some of those coming up in another top 10. But for this week, have a great one. Make sure you subscribe. We'll be doing all kinds of other holiday-themed videos for the rest of the month.